Dyer, a director in RSK's Geosciences business. Welcome to the May edition of our 2026 series of Down to Earth webinars. These will cover a broad range of subjects and are available afterwards on our YouTube channel alongside previous talks. Our talk today is given by Karl Hall and Abigail Edwards from our Waste and Resources team within the Geosciences business. Karl and Abigail will be providing an overview of the requirements of the SWUK UK protocol implemented in October last year. But first, a brief note on housekeeping during the talk. All attendees' microphones are automatically muted through the webinar. During the presentation, you can post questions online and there'll be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We'll answer as many questions as possible at the end of the talk. Those that can't be answered due to time constraints will be answered after the webinar. Shortly after the webinar, you'll receive a link to a short survey. If you can take a few minutes to provide feedback so that we can improve on future webinars. Now, please let me introduce our speakers today. Karl is an Associate Director within our Waste and Resources team with over 20 years of experience in environmental and waste management. Through his early experience as an analytical chemist, alongside geoenvironmental investigation and assessment of brownfield land, Karl has a depth of knowledge in management of brownfield land. For the past 10 years, Karl has focused on waste management on construction sites and currently manages several large SWUK UK compliance projects for RSK Geosciences. Abigail is a chartered waste manager and senior consultant with RSK Geosciences Waste and Resources team. Her background includes working within remediation contracting as a compliance manager, classifying materials for treatment and disposal. Abigail worked on the SWUK UK Phase 3 sampling study and has provided training to our clients through the trials and operational phases of the protocol. Abigail works with Karl to manage a large number of SWUK UK compliance projects on behalf of major utility companies. We'll now turn our cameras off and I'll hand over to Karl and Abigail to provide details of the SWUK UK protocol.
Thanks, Hugh, and thanks to everybody who's joined today's presentation. We'll start the presentation by sharing a summary slide that sets out the items that we'll be covering today. The presentation will begin by running through the regulatory context and background for the protocol, and this will include a brief summary of the preceding waste sampling studies that provided much of the data that we used to develop the protocol. We'll then take a more in-depth look at the sampling, testing and classification requirements under the protocol and how these will differ to the RPSs that it ultimately replaced. At this point in the presentation, Abigail will take over the reins and she'll briefly run through our experience during the protocol's implementation phase following its approval early last year by the Environment Agency. The presentation will then move to its final part, looking at the Q4 2025 sampling data that were recently released by SWUK UK. We'll then conclude with a summary of the findings, what we think the data is saying, and what, in our opinion, we think are the challenges and potential opportunities for wider and more long-term use of the protocol. I would like to stress that today's presentation will be very much focused on the compliance sampling aspects of the protocol. So whilst we may touch on aspects related to waste management and disposal or classification using the risk assessments, all this will be very much in context of compliance sampling under the protocol. So let's get started. Like any good story, I think it's important to start at the beginning to set the backdrop and provide some context to what has led us to where we are today. So some of you will remember that prior to the protocol, certain qualifying utility excavation waste could be classified as non-hazardous without the need for sampling testing by following what was then RPS 211. However, in 2018, and what now seems like a lifetime ago, for those of us that were involved from the start, the EA served notice that it was seeking to withdraw the RPS. And whilst I wasn't directly involved in the discussions with the EA around that time, certainly the messaging we received from several of our clients who were was that the EA's reason for looking to withdraw the RPS was that it considered it to be potentially vulnerable to misuse. So in essence, this meant there was a potential risk that an unknown but potentially significant proportion of hazardous waste would be misclassified and disposed as non-hazardous under the RPS. I think it's very important to stress that whilst the agency identified a potential issue with the RPS, it did very much place the onus on Streetworks UK and its members to develop a replacement protocol for its approval. So with this in mind, Streetworks UK went to the drawing board and on reviewing its potential options, decided that a risk-based approach provided the best option for the protocol aimed at classification of wastes without the need for sampling and testing every excavation. However, Streetworks UK identified that data were needed to develop and justify the proposed approach, and so in 2019, the first of what would be 3 phases of waste sampling commenced. So the waste sampling study comprised of initial phase of sampling, which was very much a fact-finding mission, as Streetworks UK sought to establish the baseline conditions in respect to the extent of hazardous wastes that would otherwise be classified as non-hazardous under the RPS. Phase 1 was completed around the beginning of 2021, and on its conclusion, there were some 1,600 samples that were tested and assessed. And Streetworks UK review of the classification's findings indicated that around 18% of asphalt samples were determined to be hazardous due to the presence of coal tar, with between 15 to 20% of soil and subbase classified as hazardous, but mostly due to TPH, but mostly with some notable contributions from other parameters such as pH and heavy metals. However, Streetworks UK identified that the data that it had were not really geographically representative of where the excavations were taking place across the industry. And in addition to that, it identified that a standardised approach to the sampling, testing and classification was needed to reduce the effects of any variables that were being introduced via the different approaches various consultants, labs and contractors were employing. So in 2022, the second phase of the sampling study commenced, and this phase was very much designed with several key objectives in mind. These included addressing some of the issues and data gaps identified from phase 1, introducing the new desk and site risk assessment forms, which ultimately now form a key part of the new protocol. And there was also an increased focus on segregation of asphalt and from soil waste streams during sampling. The phase 2 sampling took around a year to complete and ended in 2023 with over 2,000 samples tested and assessed. The study found that whilst the proportion of hazardous asphalt waste were at broadly similar levels to those reported in phase 1, there was a significant reduction in the percentage of hazardous soil and subbase samples that were sample tested and assessed. In terms of the new risk assessments that were trialled as part of this phase, while Streetworks UK reported that overall these have worked relatively well, they were identified as being potentially over-conservative in the classification outcomes when compared to the lab data. And so some fine-tuning was needed and a further phase of waste sampling was carried out. So the third, and what we now know was the final phase of sampling, was carried out in 2024. Similar to the previous phases, just over 2,000 samples were collected as part of this phase, and whilst there was a little difference in the sampling and testing approach, a revised set of more streamlined and targeted risk assessments were introduced. So in essence, this phase of sampling was perhaps focused on the, actually quantifying the proportion of hazardous waste that was present. Rather, it was more aimed at assessing the efficacy of the new risk assessments in terms of those arriving at a correct classification. So on completion of phase 3 sampling, Streetworks UK undertook a review of the data and generally identified a good correlation between the respective classifications derived by risk assessment and sampling. So in autumn of 2024, Streetworks UK presented its findings to the EA, and following what I'm sure was a period of much negotiation and clarification. In February of last year, the protocol was approved and published with a hard start date for use from the 1st of October 2025. In addition, it was also confirmed that RPS 298, which had been introduced the previous summer to replace RPS 211, would also be withdrawn around the same time that the protocol was formally implemented. So, moving on to the next slide, I think it's useful to summarise the key differences between the protocol and the RPSs that it replaces, specifically in relation to the sampling, testing and classification requirements. So as you'll see on the screen, for context, we've also included the requirements under WM3, as this has always been applicable and still is applicable for non-qualifying excavation wastes, and it is also a spectre that potentially looms large for those that ultimately perform poorly when using the new protocol. So starting from the top, the main works type qualifying criteria. So this really is based on what's on the streetworks permit. So the protocol retains the categories that were defined in RPS 298, which previously removed some of the ambiguity that were in, or that was in RPS 211 regarding the qualifying works. So as you can see, there's some very sort of distinct categories in terms of the permit that would qualify for use of the protocol. In respect to the volume limits, unlike the preceding RPSs, there's no volume limit under the protocol. So in some respects, the protocol is similar to WM3 in terms of the volume that it can cover. Moving on to classification. So the RPSs were very much limited to non-hazardous classifications for selected Chapter 17 codes in the list of waste, whereas the protocol can be used for non-haz and hazardous classifications. However, again, these will ultimately be limited to Chapter 17 codes in the list of waste. And finally, we'll cover sampling, which is one of the key new requirements under the protocol and very much the purpose of today's presentation. Under the Streetworks UK protocol, users are required to sample, test and assess a proportion of their annual excavations. And really this is to demonstrate their accuracy of use of the protocol. Under the RPSs, sampling and testing were not required, but this was very much contingent on meeting the stricter qualifying criteria for the RPSs and was very much limited to non-hazardous waste only. So that's a bit of a summary of the RPS versus the protocol in terms of classification options. So moving on to the next slide, what are the compliance sampling requirements under the protocol? So in essence, in Q4 2025, all users of the protocol started at the same point, which is the requirements to undertake random sampling on 1% of their annual excavations. For all users of the protocol, this target number was confirmed by Streetworks UK based on the total annual number of qualifying excavations that the user undertook across the calendar year 2 years previously. So, as an example, the sampling targets for this year are based on the total qualifying excavations that a user carried out in 2024. I think it's important to stress that the 1% sampling target is very much a starting point, and as use of the protocol progresses and individual performance varies between users, there will be some divergence between what users are basically sampling as an individual sampling target each year. So there is a potential that the sampling could increase up to 2% or 3% of all excavations. But we are hopeful that all users will perform to the minimum standard to retain use of the protocol and not be required to follow WM3, which would essentially mean 100% of excavations need to be sample tested and assessed. In respect to sampling frequencies, on an individual site-by-site basis, well, for those sites that are lucky enough or unlucky enough to be sampled, depending on which way you look at it, the frequency of sampling is 1 sample per 10 cubic metre waste type mobilised from an excavation. So if we account for the likely different waste types that may be mobilised from an excavation, together with potential variances in waste volumes between excavations, based on our experience, we think that users of the protocol can expect, on average, to be taking around 2 samples per excavation. So once all the samples are collected and the classification complete, there is a new requirement now that the protocol users, similar to how waste returns work, within 3 months of the sampling quarter ending, they are required to submit a quarterly sample returns log to SWUK UK. So the quarterly returns log is, in essence, a high-level summary spreadsheet analysing the accuracy of the classification obtained via the risk assessment for a site versus the classification determined from the sampling and testing. In conjunction with this, users are also required to upload their site-specific sample classification certificates to a central register on the Street Manager platform. As the classifications in the central register grows, this should prove to be, in my opinion, an extremely useful classification guide for future utilities that need to excavate in a given area or postcode where sampling and classification has previously been carried out. So moving across the page, with the quarterly returns validated by SWUK UK, for each user, these results are then combined with the previous quarter results and then shared with the EA for review and comment. And then finally, in Q4 of each year, SWUK UK reviews each user's performance for the previous 4 quarters and confirms the annual sampling target percentage for the following year. So there's a couple of graphs or tables, I should say, on the bottom, just setting out what those performance and sample band targets are. So as part of the ongoing quarterly performance reviews undertaken by the SWUK UK and the agency, any organisations that are identified as having consecutive back-to-back quarters in the red zone in terms of performance banding may be suspended from using the protocol until such time it can demonstrate that it's improved performance in its use. So technically speaking, WM3 would need to be followed, and that could mean that up to 100% of excavations would require sampling testing to determine classification. I think it's important to caveat that some of the information included on this side, particularly in the 2 boxes on the right hand side, is very much based on our interpretation of SWUK UK reporting and performance calendar. I think ultimately the proof will be in the pudding as and when the first annual sampling period is finalised and SWUK UK communicates its findings. At this point, I'll hand the presentation over to Abigail, who will take you through the Q4 2025 sampling data, which was recently released by SWUK UK and is very much hot off the press.
Thanks, Karl. So, as we've kind of talked about in terms of the background and the timeline of how the SWUK protocol came to be, it was released for kind of the utility sector back in February of last year, with a drop dead date of October 1st for implementation. So it gave about 8 months or so for the utilities sector essentially to prepare themselves for the new protocol coming in, which meant that there were really big and operational changes within the industry. Obviously, a lot of the work is done at site level, with site operatives being required to complete site risk assessments. We've got office teams or support teams doing their desk-based risk assessments. So it was a big operational change for a lot of the utilities industry and our clients especially. So as part of that, RSK, with its experience within the preceding sampling trials, we had a really good understanding of how the protocol could be implemented and how we could support our clients in that process. So we had a number of returning clients after their participation in the trial phases, but we also onboarded a number of returning new clients. And I think a lot of that was due to our experience in and being able to upscale what we had provided during the trial phases. So as part of that, between June and October 2025, there was a lot of work being done in the background within the utility sector, and we supported with over 20 training sessions between in that period. And as part of our training, we always feel it's really important to cover the relevant background of the protocol, to really contextualize it for our clients and the operatives who will be ultimately undertaking the sampling process, and then combining that with really on-site practical sampling training sessions. So we went out to a number of live sites, went through the process in its entirety to really demystify and contextualize the process. Because for a lot of operatives, we found that, you know, they'd never had to take any form of sampling because of the preceding regulatory position statements. So being able to go through that with them, demystify it, and really kind of give them the confidence to undertake that procedure themselves. And because of that, we've had really, really positive engagement from our utilities clients and those implementing the protocol. And then secondary to that, it meant that when it came to October the 1st, clients were ready to hit the ground running and had already kind of worked out their very initial teething issues. And, you know, we were ready and willing to accept all the data that was essentially coming our way from October 1st. When October 1st did hit, the protocol was implemented across the utility sector. I think there was a really large uptake from the labs and people submitting samples, which is a really positive thing to see in terms of engagement with the protocol. And I think our partner EnviroLab, I think they had approximately a 15% increase in the sample throughput in that kind of first quarter session. So it was really good to be able to see that process working following the kind of previous 8 or 9 years of design of the protocol. Then, you know, January to March 2026, we had all the quarter 4 2025 data submitted to StreetWorks UK, and then we have some initial findings that were circulated from StreetWorks UK within the beginning of May. So based on the data that StreetWorks UK have provided in regards to quarter 4 2025, there was a total of 4,641 total samples submitted under the protocol. And generally, that it's a fairly even split between the number of bituminous and soil subbase samples. Now, we don't know if this was the total number of samples expected based on the 1% sampling requirements, but what we do know and what we can see is that as a whole, the industry kind of mobilised as quickly as possible following October 1st, and over a 3-month period, I think that is a significant volume of sampling to have been submitted from a sector that previously wasn't expected to do so. As we move forward into quarter 1 to quarter 4 of 2026, it's likely that the sample volumes will increase as the year goes on. However, we'll await further commentary by StreetWorks UK on those sample volumes. In terms of how RSK supported during that quarter, so as a team, we supported with approximately 35% of the total samples that were committed for quarter 4 2025, which I think is a really positive demonstration of our expertise and the processes that we had in place from that previous sampling study. So I think it's a really clear demonstration of our ability to upscale our processes. And I think being able to coordinate directly with our in-house lab, EnviroLab, has given us a little bit more control and oversight of issues and coordination with our clients. So we've been able to kind of really monitor those samples coming in, identify those issues early on, and manage that process for our clients. And that was for about approximately 1,500 samples. And I think this is a real valuable thing for our clients, because I think it gave a smooth transition as clients implemented the protocol themselves. So when we look at it by sector, we can see that the most significant proportion of samples were submitted by the water sector. So we had about, over half of the total volume of samples submitted by the water sector, followed by the telecoms as the most significant contributor, and then fairly evenly split then between electric and gas, with a smaller proportion submitted by wastewater and the Highways Authority. In terms of SWUK UK's review of the accuracy performance data that they've provided, it's quite clear to see from the overall performance that nearly all sectors are achieving that above 80% green quarterly performance banding, which I think is a really, really positive outcome, given that this is the first quarter that the protocol has been implemented. Highways Authority sitting in that amber banding at the moment, but it is worth noting that, comparatively throughout all the sectors, they had a really low submission number of samples submitted, and I think it obviously at lower numbers, those percentages are going to mean more. So I think as the highway authorities, and likely for wastewater as well, start submitting more samples, it's likely that they will be able to meet that required compliance accuracy scoring for their quarters. And I think it's a really positive sign that the protocol is operating as required, and we would expect this to improve as the quarters progress. So for all results in quarter 4 2025, I think for the sectors hitting above 90% in their overall performance is really, really positive, and hopefully that will quite easily progress to above that 93% accuracy for those wanting to remain at the 1% sampling frequency. When we consider the bituminous samples that were submitted, so we have over 2,021 asphalt samples that were submitted, with approximately 94.2% of those samples classified as non-hazardous. We have 111 samples that were submitted and classified as hazardous due to the presence of coal tar, so about 5.5%. And then we have 0.35% or 7 samples classified as hazardous due to other. Now, we haven't got any kind of commentary on what that other classification stems from, but it is really positive to see that the overall volume of samples submitted are generally being classified as non-hazardous. In terms of the samples that RSK have processed during that time, we only had 37 samples that were assessed as hazardous due to the presence of coal tar, so that's sitting at around 5%. So I think that's really positive to know that the data that we're collecting is consistent with the wider SWUK UK data and outcomes that they're presenting. It's also important to note from our experience that not all of our clients are using pack marker spray. Obviously, that is an optional undertaking as part of the protocol. So I think for our clients to only have 37 samples classified as hazardous over our entire submission, then I think that's really positive that hopefully our operatives are happy and able to identify coal tar without the use of any pack marker spray. When it comes to the soil subbase samples, so we had approximately 2,620 samples submitted to SWUK UK during quarter 4, and obviously with soil and subbase samples there's a larger testing requirement, and therefore there's a larger range of potential contaminants compared to the bituminous samples. And for those of us who are kind of more experienced with construction and excavation waste, there are some of these contaminants are obviously quite difficult to identify at the point of excavation. So when we assess the data that SWUK UK have provided, we've got one excavation or one sample that was classified as hazardous due to the presence of visible asbestos. which would be excluded under the protocol, and might be a thing for the utility sector to consider, whether their operatives are happy and able to identify potential asbestos within their excavations. We have one sample that was classified as hazardous due to an inclusion of coal tar. 6 samples, again, classified as hazardous without any further data. And then the bulk of our hazardous samples sit within the contamination elements of TPH, heavy metals, and pH. And these are really common contaminants within the construction, demolition, excavation waste sector. So with our data that we've managed, we had about 4% of our samples classified as hazardous. You know, similarly, it was predominantly TPH, heavy metals, and pH. And due to our management of the chemical data and also the technical procedures and training that we put in place, we really think that has benefited our clients to getting the best out of their data. So our training really focuses on the importance of segregating asphalt at point of source and when you are submitting your samples for assessment, which means that we're trying to really reduce and limit any of that potential interference when we have bitumen within our soil samples. We you know, also put in places the use of oil source ID and marker compounds in our waste oil assessment, so we can review the TPH value instead of just kind of looking at the value and taking it as that. We can do a little bit of further digging to make sure we're assessing against the most relevant thresholds. And similarly for the heavy metals, we're able to review in the context of what we're expecting and what the likely contamination is. pH testing is a really important one if we're working within excavations that there's been some form of concrete breakout, and we really stress that with our labs that all our testing is sampled as received, and also reviewing our supporting records to review whether it's likely that our samples are going to have a high pH. And I think that's one of the benefits of having trained and experienced waste assessors, that we can review the data in the context of the whole excavation and our knowledge of WM3 to make sure that we're getting the best out of the data and interpreting it in a holistic view, rather just kind of taking the data at face value. So I'll hand back to Karl for a bit of a summary.
Thanks, Abigail. I think that's a very useful and interesting review of the data. So as we come to the end of the presentation, I think it's useful to summarise what the Q4 25 data released by SWUK UK is telling us, and what, in our opinion, are some of the potential challenges, opportunities for use of the protocol over the next year or so. So ultimately, at a high level, the data released by SWUK UK is positive overall. The overall compliance with the protocol is sitting around 92% and is within the green zone in terms of the performance banding criteria. In terms of the non-compliances, the trend is, it appears it's very much for the site-based risk assessments to under-assess the classification. And that means that the site-based risk assessment assesses a waste type as non-haz, whereas the subsequent sampling and lab testing determines hazardous. This is particularly true for soil and sub-base samples. I think the ratio is around 15:1 in terms of over-assessments and under-assessments. It's less so for asphalt samples, much more of an even split between under-assessment and over-assessment, and this is really likely due to the sensitivity and user subjectiveness, if you like, when using the pack spray as the field screen for coal tar. So whilst overall performance using the protocol has been good, there's clearly still a little bit of work to do to improve the accuracy in its use. And this much is evident in the summary of the initial findings that were circulated by SWUK UK, and I think they've identified that segregation of materials on site during excavation to avoid bituminous material, i.e. asphalt soils, is a key priority for this year. That being said, as sample classifications are added to the central register on Street Manager and this database grows, this will only help to increase the accuracy of the classifications derived via the site risk assessments. And I think this will particularly assist with the risk-based classification of asphalt waste streams. So as the information grows on areas where asphalt waste containing coal tar is present, so too should, in theory, the accuracy of the desk-based and the site-based assessments. As it stands, we're not sure if the EA has provided any feedback to SWUK UK on the Q4 25 data. However, based on the SWUK UK reporting calendar, it would appear to be late summer before we get any meaningful commentary from the EA. And it will be interesting to see what comments the agency has and if there's any particular areas of focus or improvement that are identified. In terms of longer term and more widespread use of the protocol, we did note in the Q4 data that at least one highways authority was using the protocol last year. And a few years back, I did read somewhere that highways account for around 30% of excavations carried out in the road. So it will be interesting to see if there's a wider uptake by the highway sector in terms of its use of the protocol. In addition to this, there's also the potential that in the mid to long term, the devolved nations, i.e. Wales and Scotland, may also move towards using the protocol. And I'm guessing they're just waiting to see if its use proves to be a success in England. So lots of opportunities, and I think the next year or so is going to be very interesting. So as we move away from the technical part of the presentation, as is always the case with presentations like this, there's a little bit of marketing involved to give us the opportunity to sell our wares. So for those looking, or for those on this call that are looking for some support, the SWUK UK compliance sampling requirements, RSK, my team, we can offer a variety of technical support services, and these can be tailored very much to your needs. This can range from a full end-to-end service where we undertake all elements, including sampling, testing, reporting, classification, and this is all delivered fully in-house by RSK companies. We're also able to offer each of these services individually. We're also able to provide excavation waste sampling training should you choose to do self-sampling and collect those samples yourself. In addition to this, next slide, please. In addition to this, our waste and resources team, we're not just limited to SWUK UK compliance sampling. We can help with our clients with a wide range of other waste-related issues and requirements. And we can also provide support in areas including environmental permitting, WM3 waste classifications, EIAs, support planning submissions, and we've also got a team of experts, and we can help in complex or potentially contentious waste-related projects, and this can include the provision of expert witnesses and support with due diligence assessments. So if you need anything, feel free to drop a message in the chat, and we'll be happy to have a discussion with you. So that concludes the presentation. I think we've got to a Q&A part of the talk. Hopefully that was enjoyable and useful for everyone. Yeah, interesting times.
Yes, thanks, Karl. Thank you both. Thanks for taking us through that brilliant presentation on SWUK UK protocol. We've had a number of questions come through, so I think we've got time for a few questions. So I think the first question is probably for you, Karl. Have there been noticeable differences between the sample data from Q4 2025 and then Q1 in 2026?
It's a good question. I think in terms of the data that we're looking at, and we're very much looking at, is it hazardous or is it non-hazardous? We do support some clients with their quarterly returns, but for a lot of clients, we're just undertaking the classification aspects. I would say it's broadly similar in terms of the sort of classification outcomes that we're getting. However, what I would say is we also do review the sampling records that are submitted. And so we get to see all the waste types that are being sampled out on site. And there definitely has been a clear improvement, if you like, in terms of the segregation of the asphalt and the soil waste streams, because I think a lot of the early samples we were getting, it certainly looked like it was essentially a mixed waste that had been sampled. Whereas now there's a clear sort of segregation, and it looks like there's been a clear push or messaging to ensure that those waste streams are segregated. So I think ultimately that will feed in and support the the compliance and the accuracy of the classifications. But in terms of the data we've looked at, there's still a bit to process from Q1. But yeah, I think it's broadly similar.
Okay. A question, I think this is probably for Abigail. When you're looking at the lab data, can you tell then whether samples are hazardous or non-hazardous just from looking at the data that you've got?
Yes, so you can't confirm a waste classification just from looking at the raw chemical data. You need to ensure that the classification and the assessment is done following the guidance in WM3. There are some contaminants, things like heavy metals, which can exhibit additional hazardous properties. So we can't just consider them as an individual component. There are some additive considerations that you need to assess. And additionally, it's important to kind of interpret your data as a whole. So taking into account everything that's been submitted, all of the reported data, how things might interact, and how that also compares to the submitted site records. So what was physically there on site, what was sampled, and that's really important to accurately assessing your data against the correct thresholds and the criteria. So it is one of those things that you can't just look at the lab report and decide whether it's hazardous or non-hazardous. It's something that engaging with a really experienced waste assessor can be really invaluable to your project and your submission to the protocol to get the best result that you can, essentially.
So what do contractors and site workers need to think about when taking samples?
So I'll take that one, Karl. There are a few things that you will want to think about when you're taking samples. So at the point of excavation, we would always advise that segregation is key. Even small amounts of asphalt can influence the outcome of your resulting classification and assessment, as it can cause interference within that TPH banding. And then there's also things about effective record keeping. So photographs of the excavation are always really, really useful, and completion of the excavated waste record sheet. And that provides that supporting evidence to whoever's undertaking the assessment and classification in contextualizing the data that they're reviewing. We'd also say making sure that you take in really good quality composite samples so that we're assessing the stockpile, the mobilized material as a whole, rather than just considering an isolated area within the stockpile, which will really make sure that your data is as representative as possible. Secondary to that, there's also having an understanding of what your lab needs when you're submitting your samples. So making sure you've got the right sampling containers as required by the lab and their procedures, making sure you know how to fill them and label them correctly, and getting them off to the lab as soon as you can, so that they're all in date and can be accredited appropriately to ensure that you get the most reliable set of results that you can.
Right, fantastic. I've just got one more question I think that we can squeeze in today. Based on your experience, this is probably to Karl, based on your experience, do you find that consultant end-to-end sampling, scheduling and assessment, or sampling and site records provided by the client works best? And does client supplied data lead to any problems or inconsistencies?
Yeah, so I think ultimately our preference would always be that we would undertake the full process. And that's obviously it's extra work for us, which we want, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is obviously sampling is at the core of RSK's business, and so we've got staff that are trained and they know what to do in terms of the sampling, and it gives us a great control over the full process, if you would like, so we can intervene or capture any issues, and it also helps us in terms of the consistency and the robustness of the classification reporting. So the preference is that we would do it ourselves. However, do appreciate that that's not always a good option, sort of in today's economic environment. And similarly, we've got no issues if our clients choose to do the self sampling or undertake the sampling themselves. However, we are quite insistent that if we are supporting with projects that are set up like that any of our clients' operatives that are undertaking the sampling, that we deliver some excavation waste sampling training to them, and that's really just to ensure, if you like, that the records and the sample quality in terms of what's being collected and submitted, stands up to scrutiny. And ultimately, what we're looking at is providing an accurate classification. So if we've got that confidence that the samples are being collected as they need to be, and we've got all the supporting records, there's no issues with us, providing that as a service. But we are generally quite insistent that if we are doing the classification and the testing, there is some training that we deliver just to support the process.
Yeah, I know, that's understandable. Yeah. Okay, no, that's brilliant. Thank you for answering those questions. We'll end the questions there, and then further questions will be answered once Karl and Abigail have had a chance to review these. So our next Down to Earth talk will be on Tuesday, the 9th of June, and we'll look at sustainability targets and the new Syria guidance. Please remember to complete the feedback following the presentation, and thank you for attending today, and we'll see you again in June.